Welcome to the Media Storm studio. Our guest today is a British journalist and political activist who is no stranger to being attacked for his views and even removed from spaces for his views. He's an outspoken human rights analyst, co-founder of the pro-EU youth group Our Future, Our Choice, and has written for news outlets such as The Independent, Guardian and Metro. Welcome to the studio, Femi Oluwole.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Hey, Femi. So nice to see you again.
You too.
So, freedom of speech, that's what we're talking about today. It has always been a major political battleground, but in today's world it's considered a core human right, a pillar of democracy. It's enshrined in the US's First Amendment. It is also enshrined in the UK's 1998 Human Rights Act, but it is not without controversy, and some argue that free speech absolutism is its own kind of tyranny. Femi, in theory, where do you stand on this spectrum? Should free speech have a limit?
I think the limit in terms of what should be legally punished is it can't go up to the level of implied incitement to violence. So anything that's obviously if you tell somebody to hurt somebody else, I think that crosses the line because it's like a mob hit. You're telling them go hurt this person. If your language implies that person is less than human and therefore is worthy of being taken out, for example, calling people vermin, that sort of language, I believe that crosses the line. However, I do believe that in terms of how society functions, in terms of what the law should punish, I think the line should be drawn at implied incitements to violence.
That's interesting, okay, because a lot of people would say you should never be criminalized for something you've said, only for something you've done. But I guess what you acknowledge there is, well, speech can be an action. The line between speech and action is always blurred. And if what you were saying incites a criminal action, then it should be criminal.
It would be insane if we said that if I pay somebody to murder somebody else, then because I haven't actually done it myself, I'm not liable for the crime itself. If I tell somebody, go out and burn down a hotel with refugees inside, I should be liable for that as well. There are those on the left who would go further than I do in terms of saying that racism, saying racist things should be criminalized. But I personally don't think so. I think one of the reasons why I'd like to be in a position where we say free speech should include things that we fundamentally disagree with is because if we had a proper democracy, then I believe most people are generally good. I believe most people, the way that they tend to vote tends to be good. Unfortunately, in this voting system where majority of votes effectively don't count, that our voting system continuously skews politics towards the right and against marginalized groups. It's because of that people often feel, well, if the system isn't fair, we have to clamp down on the stuff that endangers us.
We will get on to the challenges to the sort of traditional left-right logic on the free speech debate, but let's bring it into current affairs.
Yeah, free speech has basically been in every current affairs story recently. And the first one we want to look at looks at the pulling of fact checkers from social media, apparently in the name of free speech. In January, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced Facebook and Instagram would ditch independent fact-checkers in the name of restoring free expression, though many argue it was to please Trump. If so, it worked.
Elon Musk also pledged to turn X into a free speech forum by sacking 80% of engineers dedicated to trust and safety on the platform. Instead, he now uses it as his personal propaganda playground and is literally at the top of my notifications every day, even though I neither follow him nor engage with any of his content ever. He, for example, banned the account @ElonJet, which tracked his private jet using public data, but promoted fake news stories about an asylum seeker being behind the stabbing of 3 little girls in the UK last summer. In fact, before the real killer, went on his stabbing spree, we have since learned that he watched a graphic video of a stabbing in Sydney on X that the company had refused to take down. There is a clear algorithmic bias to the so-called free speech forum.
Social media was once heralded as a way of circumventing media gatekeepers and giving a voice to the people. But the algorithm favours clickbait and breeds fake news and bots. Femi, do we have to rethink our ideas about free speech in an era of social media?
I think the reason why you're seeing this clamp down on fact-checking, this buying up of social media platforms by the billionaires is because they realize that if they don't do that, they will lose. Given that our generations, millennials, Gen Z, have a kind of politics that is naturally very, very different from everything that's gone before. In fact, the Financial Times actually worked out that at the age of 35, your average boomer, your average person from the silent generation, and Gen X was 5 points less conservative than the national average. But by the time they reached the age of 70, they were 5 points more conservative, which is the general trend of you get more conservative as you get older. But millennials at the age of 35 are 15 points less conservative than the national average.
Right.
So we've fundamentally broken that trend. If you don't support equality, our generations don't want to hear from you. One of the reasons why people are turning against the right is because we can see the right's agenda play out. We can see that right now in America. Things aren't going so well with Trump's tariffs crashing the economy. I think the UK has an advantage in terms of Brexit, in terms of the fact that the far right has already, they tied their flag to the mast of Brexit for 27 years, saying this is going to help working class people. And now even Brexit voters, by a ratio of 45-9, believe that Brexit has made us poorer. So you can't make that argument based on facts anymore. So you have to push out fake news. You have to push out misinformation. You have to buy up media platforms and control the conversation because they have no choice. Otherwise, they will lose.
So you say you can't make that argument in facts anymore. Okay, so you make it in emotions. That's something that really, is carries currency in the social media space. This is, I think, the tricky thing with social media and free speech. It changes the rules, right? In the traditional news media space, things have to be fact-checked or they can't pass. But in the social media space, well, emotion carries more currency than fact. I say that's slightly idealizing the traditional news media, but, you get my point. And also on social media, unlike in the marketplace of ideas in face-to-face conversation, we can be anonymous. And so people can put out any speech and they don't have to tie their identity to it. And that also changes the rules. And so these ideals that we have about free speech, right, that they're grounded in this logic of a marketplace of ideas. People can say bad things, people can say good things, and the good things will win out in this free form of speech. But on social media, it plays into and rewards the worst tendencies of human nature. It doesn't reward reasoned, evidence-based conversation. That's not the speech that wins out on social media. It rewards a totally different type of speech. And that's why I'm like, do we have to rethink our idea about free speech in a social media climate where it's a mob rule of a wholly different thing we've seen before?
So I believe that if social media was essentially fair, that if every voice had an equal weighting, things would end up in the right direction. I mean, there's a reason why the right hates and demonizes academia, because they know that academics, the more you study society, the more you're aware of the injustices, and the more, by definition, you become the definition of woke. And I think that's why I believe that TikTok is potentially such a huge tool, because in that marketplace of ideas, it's actually a free market in theory, because people are telling their own stories. You get a different perspective on different groups of people. For example, my favorite TikTok was from a Muslim woman in the States who said that one of her colleagues, she was said that the only Muslims she'd ever come into contact with were on TikTok. Not from Fox News, not from media, from Hollywood demonizing Muslims as terrorists. It was exclusively from Muslims saying this is who we are. It's a lot harder to convince somebody that you should bomb or invade another country if the day before you saw somebody from that country do a makeup tutorial. Like, that perception of people comes from having an actual free marketplace of ideas. The problem is that the people that are running these companies, they are trying to not make it a free marketplace of ideas against marginalized groups and in favor of the right. And I do think that in terms of that marketplace of ideas, skew things, you can't have a free market of ideas and a free market of media ownership. It doesn't work. Because if you have a free market of media ownership, eventually it will be owned by those who have the most money. They will create a monopoly, and eventually you'll only have certain views being able to dominate. It defeats the very concept of a free market of ideas.
So how could we regulate freedom of ownership to regulate freedom of speech?
I think you'd want to set a limit on the percentage of the market share of all media, mainstream media like TV, radio, etc., that any one individual can have, to make sure that nobody can essentially control the narrative of an entire country or the West in general. And I think you should also have rules on social media platforms that prevent them from being owned by one specific individual. If it could be democratized in some way, I'd like that. And also, moving back to this framework of ideas, I don't think we should be subject to them at the mercy of this idea of, well, whichever post gets the most interaction, that's the one that should get promoted. Because we should be able to have AI that can tell what kind of interactions are happening. Is this post being flooded with thousands of comments saying no, that's a lie? In which case, then no, that's not a good post to promote.
Right.
We have the power to make this better.
Okay. So that is interesting because social media, from that perspective, it can be a key to better free speech. Media Storm, we literally started this podcast because we recognize that not everyone has an equal voice. How free is free speech when I think it's 3/4 of newspaper circulation in the UK is owned and controlled by just 4 very, very wealthy families, and social media could change that. However, to take it back to the Zuckerberg Facebook story, well, Zuckerberg said in the name of free speech and free expression, he was removing regulation, he was removing fact checkers. And this was widely reported in our media, right, as a story about US domestic politics, democracy in crisis. But outside of the US, and beyond a lot of the mainstream media's watch, many of Facebook's fact-checking bodies were set up in response to genocidal propaganda spreading on the site, for example, against the Rohingya in Myanmar or against Muslims in India. An open letter signed to Zuckerberg by over 100 fact-checking organizations from all over the world warned after his announcement that some of these countries are highly vulnerable to misinformation that spurs political instability, election interference, mob violence, and even genocide. If Meta decides to stop the program worldwide, it is almost certain to result in a real-world harm in many places. Brazil's Attorney General also sent its own letter saying that the changes are not in line with Brazilian legislation and they're not sufficient to protect the fundamental rights of its citizens. This story, it shouldn't have just raised alarm about US democracy. It should have raised questions about minority safety all over the world. This points to a hierarchy of rights in this debate about free speech. Some people's free speech come before other people's right to not face discrimination or not face violence. How big a role does race, ethnicity play in the free speech debate? And does our media sufficiently recognize this?
I think that's a perfect example because we saw, like here at home, with the riots last summer, and let's call them what they are. They were white supremacist terrorism. People were being targeted in the streets. People were trying to burn down hotels because of the either ethnic minority status or immigration status of the people in those hotels. And it was being fueled by misinformation online. It was being fueled by the misinformation that the killer in Southport was a Muslim refugee, blah, 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 whereas in fact he was a boy called Axel, born to immigrant parents, who was born in Cardiff. And that misinformation directly put millions of ethnic minority people across the country in danger. I remember personally waking up from a nightmare during those riots with my fists clenched looking around the room because I genuinely believed I was about to be pulled from my car like happened to that man in Hull. This put genuine fear in the minds of ethnic minority people across the country. And your right to say, let's go burn down that refugee hotel isn't exactly as important as my right to know that I can cross the street without being attacked for the color of my skin.
And I can, speak to that as well. What was missing in the media, especially at that time, getting caught up in that free speech debate, was the real life experiences of ethnic minorities like you, like me, and the fact that we were scared to go outside even, and I think we spoke about it on a Media Storm episode when there was a feed that came through that said, oh, there's going to be a potential riot in West London where a lot of my family are. It was genuinely scary. And I don't think that that narrative was put across. Femi, you have personally spoken out about one particular incident where you felt your freedom of speech was taken from you by a party who self-brand as being pro free speech, and that race played a central role in this. Can you tell us what happened and why this was an affront to free speech in your eyes?
So the Reform Party's attacks on my free speech go back a fair way. Like, it goes back to 2019 when I tweeted that Richard Tice had set up an overtly anti-Jewish organization because he was one of the founders of Leave.eu, which has been regularly tweeting pictures of George Soros, a Jewish Holocaust survivor, holding puppet strings controlling politicians such as Tony Blair, which is such an overt anti-Semitic trope it doesn't even need to be defended. And so he then sent an email to me from his lawyers telling me to take down the post, apologize, and pay £10,000 to a charity of his choosing. I had £2,000 in the bank, and I showed him my bank balance in the video that I put up, saying, "Hey, come at me. I've got nothing to lose. You're the one who looks silly as the champion of free speech and standing up for the little guy while sending an army of London lawyers after a student activist for a tweet." There was a rally in Stafford, and I went there. I showed them my press pass to let me in. I managed to interview several of their candidates, and I got them to say on camera that Brexit had made people poor, and quote, "Sometimes you have to take a little pain for things to work in the future."
They're not going to want you interviewing their candidates again, are they?
Exactly. So they kicked me out of the venue because of that. Then fast forward to the one that made the news, which was in Birmingham. I'd bought a ticket and I was just waiting in the queue quietly. I had nothing on me. I just had my press pass and a selfie stick with my camera on it. And then they singled me out from the queue. Said, "Your ticket's been revoked. You need to leave." And I said, "Why?" They said, "We haven't got a reason." And they physically pushed me and pulled me to get me out of the venue.
Actually, you point out as well, that Reform Party, one of the founders of Reform Party, has said that black men are inherently violent. This is a party that supposedly believes in free speech and is refusing to be challenged by a journalist and removing a black male journalist without given reason, from the conference, and both denying themselves of accountability for that view to that demographic, and also just generally, denying your ability to challenge their ideas in the free marketplace of ideas that any free speech advocate should believe in.
Yeah, they fundamentally are not in favor of free speech. It has always been a lie.
Thing is, I feel like these individuals, a lot of them, I think they do believe that they believe in free speech and don't necessarily see the hypocrisy of their own action.
I think it's always really important to make a distinction between the politicians and those who follow them. For example, I do believe that a lot of Reform Party voters do believe in some of the stuff that's being spewed by the people at the top. But if you are working in politics full time, you cannot be stupid enough to not be aware that suing student activists for tweets isn't compatible with being the champions of free speech. So they're either literally brain dead or they're liars.
Our next focus area, current affairs story, is the censorship of critics of Israel and its allies in the West. Probably one of the most terrifying attacks on free speech in our listener societies today is happening in the US, where student activists calling out genocidal actions against Palestinians, actions that have been described as genocide by some of the world's most respected bodies, are being literally abducted off the streets and detained without judicial process.
This is not just an issue in the US. Much of the so-called free press around the liberal world have conformed to official narratives in their coverage of the war and the occupation and the downplaying of crimes against humanity wherever Western governments are complicit. One analysis by Intercept last year compared over 1,000 articles from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, found a gross imbalance with highly emotive terms for the killing of civilians like slaughter or massacre or horrific, which were reserved almost exclusively for Israelis who were killed by Palestinians, rather than the other way around. For example, the terms slaughter and massacre were used to describe the killing of Israelis 60 times more than for Palestinians. The list goes on.
We've talked about this on Media Storm many times, and we've talked about the indirect censorship driving this, such as the conflation of Palestinians with terrorists as a way of denouncing anyone who humanizes and mourns them as terrorist sympathizers, or the conflation of anti Semitism and anti Zionism as a way of censoring legitimate criticisms of the Israeli state under hate speech protections. What does the state of debate and coverage of the Israeli Palestinian conflict tell us about free speech in the West?
That it's fundamentally broken, and that those in charge of how our discourse runs are incredibly hypocritical. I think my favorite, if I can use that term, example of this is genuinely Richard Tice, because Richard Tice has been, for the past year and a half, accusing anybody who goes on those protests against the genocide in Gaza of being anti-Semitic. And this is the same person who tried to sue me for a tweet where I called his organization anti-Semitic.
Wow. That is a really pointed comparison. Yeah.
Like, I called having a cartoon of a Jewish Holocaust survivor holding puppet strings, controlling politicians, anti-Semitic. He's calling complaining about the genocide of thousands of innocent people anti-Semitic. The hypocrisy is off the scale.
I think something interesting about this topic in the context of the free speech debate is that with anti-Semitism, which is a really real and nasty form of racism, and the valid protections that are in place against anti-Semitism, those have been used to censor a legitimate form of criticism and free speech that is not to do with Judaism at all, but to do with the actions of an Israeli state. And I think that that's very interesting in the free speech debate because, in the past, it would be the left talking about protections against hate speech, and some people on the right would say that the line has been blurred between hate speech and legitimate speech. At least it's a very, very hard line to draw. So there's issues sort of seen as switching of hands of the free speech banner from the right to the left. And some on the right might say, the lefty mob have no right now to demand free speech after their use of cancel culture. So I wonder if there is any truth to this and whether there is any cause for introspection right now on the left about how to demarcate the territory of legitimate free speech, even if it may not always be likable, and the territory of criminal, a speech that can and should be criminalized.
So if we're talking about anti-Semitism in this context, I do believe that the left and those who generally stand up for the people of Palestine should be more self-policing in terms of what words we use, because ultimately the biggest weakness in our campaign, the thing that's most used against us, is the accusation of anti-Semitism. So if you genuinely care about the people of Palestine, you should be trying to make sure that that weakness is not used against us by making sure that nothing we say can possibly be interpreted as anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have been too liberal with our use of the word Zionist, because it can be used in a 1,000 different ways. I would prefer if people would use descriptors when they talk about Zionism, i.e. military Zionism, colonial Zionism, expansionist Zionism, to distinguish it from Zionism as a core concept of should Jewish people have a homeland of some description. There are many Jewish people who have been on those marches who are fundamentally call themselves Zionists in the belief that there should be a Jewish homeland,
right?
But fundamentally oppose everything that Netanyahu is doing. And I think if you use the word Zionist as a catch-all, it gets used in very dangerous ways.
Right. And if the left is sensitive to everything they've been saying about policing language, then they should enact that
100%.
among themselves.
Exactly. and it weakens every time, because every time I see a tweet along the lines of, yeah, and they won't let this be said on the Zionist controlled media, I'm like, come on.
Right, yeah. Yeah. I think that's actually a really, really fair point.
Do you think cancel culture exists?
I don't think cancel culture is a real thing. I think there's consequence culture, and as I said before, because younger people are much more hardline in terms of, if you don't support equality, at least in principle, we don't want to hear from you. I think they're realizing that there's a much more hard line that will mean that, well, you won't have this audience anymore. And it's so hypocritical for the right to complain about cancel culture when ultimately it's called the free market. If you have a product, you as a person, you as a celebrity, you are a product that we no longer want to buy because you've shown yourself to be a terrible human being. That's the market economy. Like, and you're complaining about it as a supposed capitalist.
Right. When I think of cancel culture, right, I think of a lot of moaning and attacks from people like J.K. Rowling, who, got hate for spreading hate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and then complaining about being cancelled whilst continuing to have a far bigger platform than any of the minorities that she was using it to spread hate about. And there is a difference between wanting freedom of expression and wanting freedom from consequences of what you say. And yeah, I think the left has the upper hand on that, because the ardent defenders of free speech on the right, like Nigel Farage as another example, don't use their platforms to criticize authoritarians so much as to punch down at persecuted minorities.
Always. And in terms of the way they view cancel culture as you've taken this platform from me, I always make the point that I don't own my platform. I had 400,000 followers on Twitter, 100,000 followers elsewhere. It doesn't belong to me. It was given to me by my followers who make the decision. If I do some horrendous stuff, if I say some horrendous stuff, I will lose followers, and I should not start complaining that I've been cancelled. I've done bad stuff, and I deserve to be punished for it. That's how consequence culture works.
Yeah. Also, the frustration I feel about taking J.K. Rowling as an example and saying I've been cancelled and nobody's listening to me. Whereas ironically, I think we've been talking about her way more than we have when she wrote the Harry Potter books.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree with what are either of you saying when I really, really think about it. Yes, sometimes I do think the cancel culture, whatever we want to call it, the attacks from the left against people who say things they disagree with do go too far. But that is not the same as locking people up for their views. That is consequence culture. I agree with that. Something I would say that I've been thinking about, reflecting on, as I've tried to make sense of the free speech debate in today's politics, is at least an opportunity for finding common ground across the political divide. There's free speech within the law. That is something that serves everyone, whatever your political view, unless your political view is extremist. And I think for me that might sometimes mean swallowing the legality of views that I don't want to see aired, accepting the airing of those views is actually probably not a bad thing ultimately, as long as the marketplace of free speech exists on an even enough playing field for it to be challenged. And yeah, I guess I would say that I want to see on this topic some alliance between people with different who stand at different places of the left-right divide in their shared value of free speech within the law.
So on that sense, I would definitely agree that there's definitely some toxicity on the left that seems to be intolerant of other ways of achieving the same objective. And I do think we need to improve on that, especially given this is the next point, the voting system we're in. We have to work together if we're going to actually achieve any change. On the issue of the voting system, I think most people would want a proportional voting system, knowing that it would mean that there'd be more seats in Parliament for Farage, because ultimately, if we have a population where 12% of our population wants to vote for reform, or even 25% wants to vote for reform, we shouldn't use an unfair voting system to silence those people, because that's who we actually are. Often because we have a voting system that silences those groups, they end up feeling disenfranchised. They have their conversations away from the eyes of Parliament. They have them in back alley Facebook groups where nobody can really challenge them. And that's how you get things like Brexit, because their ideas weren't challenged for 20 years. Then we got to 2016 and nobody had actually challenged them for 20 years, and here we are.
Next, we want to talk about the MAGA 180 on free speech. Donald Trump and his inner circle have gone from parading as free speech absolutists to barring access to media organizations that criticize them, sanctioning law firms that represent political opponents, rigging social media algorithms to push party propaganda, pulling federal grants that include language they oppose, publishing a literal list of banned words, and detaining critics for non-violent protest activities without any judicial process. Femi, help us out if you can. How the hell do we make sense of the MAGA 180 on free speech?
I think it's a really good example of how free speech operates in terms of power. When Trump didn't have power, he wanted free speech to be absolute so he could say whatever he wanted without being punished for it so that he could win the election. And then now he's in power, he needs to make sure that only his narrative is allowed to thrive, and therefore he wants to completely silence anybody else. So free speech works for you if you don't have power, and free speech works against you if you do have power. And that's why free speech is so essential, so that the people in power can actually be held to account.
That's actually a really simple explanation. It makes total sense. Okay, great. Well, then we can take that story to its next step, which is that this week, Trump and co. had the nerve to threaten the UK this week over what it called our lack of free speech. On Sunday, the US State Department released a statement saying it was monitoring the UK case of Livia Tosici-Bolt, a woman who was charged for protesting outside an abortion centre and breaching the buffer zone. Peaceful protesting, but this buffer zone is designed specifically to psychologically protect people going for abortions. Now, the US right has expressed outrage. They've called this an affront to free speech, and the Trump administration has reportedly told Keir Starmer there will be no free trade without free speech.
Now, we like to think in the UK that we have a little bit more sense than the Americans, or we're more down to earth than the Americans. Apologies to any US listeners. But pundits across the UK's right-wing media have spent the week celebrating Trump's, frankly, pretty imperialist attempt to weigh in on our domestic politics. Kelvin McKenzie on GB News said, "I thank Donald Trump for his free speech ultimatum to Britain." A free speech ultimatum from a president who has literally banned words he doesn't like from publication. Andrew Tettenborn in The Spectator wrote, "Donald Trump is right about the UK's backsliding on freedom of expression. This government is not simply indifferent to free speech, it is deeply suspicious of it." And he states with total obliviousness to the irony of this statement, "The US position at least comes across as liberal and principled."
What?
I mean, why are they just not seeing what we're seeing?
It comes down to that fundamental hypocrisy of we do not consider any speech that goes against our interests to be legitimate speech. And so when he sees people being kidnapped and black bagged for criticizing the policies on Palestine, he doesn't see that as a suppression of free speech. He sees that as just standing up for America. Whereas when he sees attacks on people who are trying to harass people going for abortions, he sees that as an attack on free speech. It just shows the fundamental bias in how they view things.
I also think there's so much irony in this media that have branded their shade of conservatism as liberalism, pro-freedom, that they are now celebrating a foreign government trying to weigh in on domestic politics. So much for national sovereignty, right? Like, we leave the EU because we don't want foreign parliaments controlling our policies. Oh, but actually, you know what? If it's MAGA and if they're really our political allies on the world stage, then great, bring them in.
Yeah, you should have seen the conversation that I had on the BBC a few days ago with Paula London from GB News. It was about whether or not the tariffs were the fact that we have lower tariffs than the EU does proves that Brexit is a success. So I started out by pointing out that we do 3 times as much trade with the EU as we do with America. So slightly damaging our trade with America whilst massively damaging our trade with the EU doesn't exactly add up. And she actually said that it was a good thing that Trump was punishing Starmer with this tariff because of the free speech issue. So we've got to the point where Brexiteers are ignoring the fact that they've damaged the country mathematically, celebrating when a foreign power punishes us with tariffs.
Yeah.
You sold this country down the river, tore apart British society for a decade on the principle that sovereignty matters more than anything, and now, in the face of clear economic damage, you are saying we have to do what Big Daddy Trump says. Oh my
Oh my
God.
God. The hypocrisy, the irrationality, it's so blatant. And this is why I really think, like, particularly in this topic of free speech, reasonable people need to stand together and start calling out even those of their own political tribe who are weaponizing values like free speech to push something totally different.
No
Let's do
one
that.
say Big Daddy Trump again. That's ruined my day.
Big Daddy Trump.
My apologies.
Okay, we definitely have reached our time limit. So before we get kicked out of the studio, Femi, can you tell people where they can follow you and if you have anything to plug?
I am on YouTube as Femi_sorry. I'm on everywhere as Femi_sorry. And make sure that you are having a conversation with everybody in your society, in your friendship group, about how the UK is not a democracy, because if the majority of votes have no effect on policy making, we're not a democracy. So Starmer needs to change that.
Homework.